Hello, everyone, and welcome to our March IDEA Café on diversifying recruitment. I'm Toshi Yano. I'm co-chair of the association's IDEA committee. I'm Japanese American. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm wearing a gray shirt and my black hair is graying. Before we begin, I want to remind all our viewers that we welcome collaboration in the production of our cafes, both from member gardens and from APGA's professional communities. If your garden or community are interested in hosting a cafe, please reach out to me at my email, which I will put in the chat shortly. This year, we've decided to use our IDEA cafes to do a deep dive on the topic of diversity. Last month, we began the conversation with a panel discussion on board diversification, which I thought was ultra informative and helpful, and that was led by the IDEA Center. In April, we'll open our freeform IDEA Lounge series up to deepen the discussion we're having today around recruitment by going specifically into disability inclusion in the recruitment process. And in May, our cafe will focus on diversifying institutions over the long haul and ask what success looks like when it comes to IDEA work. Jumping into today's discussion, we'll focus on three parts of the recruitment equation: hiring, retention, and institutional culture. Our three panelists are consummate professionals and are doing work on this very topic and other important ones as well. Many of you know MaryLynn Mack, a guiding light in our industry, the association's board president, and the COO of South Coast Botanic Garden in Palos Verdes Peninsula, Los Angeles County, California. I know more of you will get to know Kevina Devereaux over the coming years. She is the Senior Director for Social Responsibility and Inclusion at Desert Botanic Garden in Phoenix, Arizona. And Ivana Lopez Espinosa is the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Manager at Matthaei Botanical Gardens and Nichols Arboretum at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan. She is one of the IDEA Committee's newest members and is already one of its guiding voices. When the four of us met last month to start planning the cafe, I said a few words about what the committee was hoping for from this conversation. And then for the next hour or so, I just listened as these three women had one of the most illuminating conversations I've heard on any subject. And I'm sure today's discussion will be just as far-ranging and engaging as that one was. And not to take my job today too lightly, but I'll probably be doing, again, much more listening and learning than anything else. What I will do is keep an eye on the Q&A, so please feel free to ask questions there, and we'll try to get to all of them. We do have the chat open, as Brianna mentioned, for you to share comments or resources. So without further ado, MaryLynn, Kevina, and Ivana, can you talk to me about recruitment, about some of the barriers to diversifying recruitment, and some of the policy changes that you think can help overcome those barriers?
Sure. I'm happy to kick it off. I'm MaryLynn, pronouns she, her, African-American, and probably my most defining feature is that I have a different pair of glasses on every day, and today they're red. I'm thrilled to be part of this webinar, and I'm really happy to see so many participants because this tells us that it's a need, that everyone has a passion about filling that need. And I think together we can all learn from each other and make our industry even stronger. And by doing that, you diversify who's working with you and for you. So, you know, I've been at this a long time and I feel like I learned as I went. And in terms of recruitment, I think one of the things we talked about last time, Ivana and Kevina, is that you've got to set a foundation before you even do the work. You've got to kind of take a look at your own backyard first and not worry about being fast, but make sure you're right. And I think a lot of that is making sure that you can identify those barriers to recruitment. And that was a conversation that I really appreciated with both of you is identifying what those barriers are, that implicit bias, so to speak, that keeps us from even beginning to recruit effectively. I'll share one, and I'd love to hear from both of you. I think that a lot of times when I've seen job descriptions or job posting, one of the barriers that people are just so used to seeing that they're not even paying attention to the fact that it exists is language. I tell people all the time with job descriptions and job postings, adjectives are the enemy. because you get there, you're getting real subjective as to who you think you need in this position. And I think the first thing everyone needs to do is pull those job descriptions out and take a good hard look and make sure some other eyes and other perspectives are on them as well, to be sure that you're not setting yourself up before you even begin.
Yeah, to follow up, something that I think about too is within the job descriptions and evaluation rubrics, how do they align and how do you know, how are you saying what you need? Like, are you transparently communicating that? Is it clear enough when someone else reads it? Are your work responsibilities and day-to-day actually reflected within the job description? And something that is important to note too is, are you being transparent about compensation, about the expectations? Something that sometimes seems a little innocent is the term when you're looking at responsibilities or additional responsibilities as they may arise. That encompasses a lot and has the potential to have a lot of inequities buried into it, because what does it mean for someone to not know what you're expecting of them and what to review? But additionally to that, to the foundation is within higher ed, we have policies that are set by here at the university, the Board of Regents. And so the way that policies are created, the possibility or power that you have to evaluate them is really important to really consider, because a lot of times inequities and biases are found in the foundations of our institutions. And it's important to go back to those policies and practices to really understand what you're doing and where you want to go.
And just jumping in on this as well, looking at job descriptions, also some of the barriers can be those wants versus, I call them wants versus needs. Do you need, look at the job description, do you need 5 years of experience for this job as a supervisor for this job? Do you need a college degree or a master's degree? I fight with my hiring managers all the time. They constantly want to put higher education on there, and I constantly question them. Is this a requirement? Is this needed to do the job? If it's not needed to do the job, then it's more of a want. And let's remove that from the job description. It could be a barrier. Things such as those things can be barriers, especially to communities of color, because sometimes they do have barriers going to receive a degree. So do you want actually the talent or do you want the educational background? So wants versus needs. Look at that when you're reviewing your job descriptions. Same thing that Ivana said, let's add more transparency. What does it pay? You know, the interview process is a long, complicated process on both ends. I want to know I want somebody to know what they're being paid before they get to the end of the process. Because we want to make sure this is worth your time and it's also worth our time. We all have a budget, and sometimes people want more outside their budget. So we have to be realistic to our applicants, to our potential applicants, what is being offered wage-wise. Right now, we're going through a recession and some people can't afford to, take pay cuts. So let's be transparent with that.
I love that about the pay. I mean, luckily here, guess what? We have to post the pay here in LA now. And I'm actually thrilled because it just removed having to have that argument with anybody about whether or not it's a good idea. But, and I like what you said, Kevina, about we all have a budget. And, we are nonprofits, we are, feeding our mission. Although I would argue that people's one of the most important elements of that. But at the end of the day, you only got so many dollars. And I think that also remove your own barrier of how you've always done it. Because I've had to be very creative here in LA to get good talent in the BIPOC community, because there's a lot of competition out here. And so I need to really see how can I move beyond the pay? And that's a real one-on-one, case-by-case basis about what is it that you need to be fulfilled in this job too. Sometimes it's that very thing that we're willing to say, look, you might not have that degree finished, but maybe we can work it out that we'll give you the time and or, some funding to make that happen. Sometimes it's the remote work. I mean, COVID changed a lot, didn't it? And I love the fact that now we're looking at remote working very differently than we did even a few years ago. But there are other kind of hidden benefits that you might have the power at your level to offer that individual. That's the very thing they need that would make this a fulfilling experience for them.
I'm going to jump in here because the questions are coming pretty fast and furious as I thought they might. So there are a couple sort of follow-up questions here. MaryLynn, one for you is, since you mentioned the adjectives that people use, what are some of the adjectives that are problematic? What do you see as getting in the way of some getting diverse candidates through the door?
Sure. I did a workshop on this and I asked groups that had signed up prior to bring their job descriptions with them and their job postings with them. And the thing that I saw that was much more common than I thought would be is polished and articulate. So that's some real subjective stuff in terms of who you would deem polished or not. And I'm just going to call it out here because we're all professionals trying to do better. They were mainly living in development type of jobs, fundraising types of jobs. And so you've already put up a wall where people are going to think, well, who's interviewing me is not going to think I'm polished. So those kinds of descriptors are difficult.
So we're talking about those subjective descriptors that, really depend on who's on the other side of the table from the candidates. That makes a lot of sense to me, especially considering that the folks on the other side of that table, the ones who are doing the hiring, are usually, people who've been in that position for a while, traditional, people in predominantly white institutions who are doing hiring. They're used to certain types of candidates, and those that sort of subjective quality can not only get in the way of the interview, but in the way of the hiring as well. I guess there's some other questions coming here, more specific questions about how to make recruitment more inclusive and diverse in unionized institutions. I don't know if any of you all have experience with that, but the question asks about restrictive collective agreements that base hiring and promoting on seniority and how that can get in the way of recruiting and promoting team members.
Well, we don't have union here with the foundation side, but we are nested in a county facility. And so the county hiring process is much different than ours, but I can say that, those are some of those things that you have to advocate for from the top. I'm lucky to be in Los Angeles and the fact that they do lead with the fact that they want to be diverse, and that there are rewards that are set in place for making sure that you do that you have a diverse workforce. So unions, I really can't speak of. Ivana, do you have that experience, or Kevina?
No, I don't have experience in unionized institutions. Something that the University of Michigan does, does have unions, but not within our garden. Something that the institution as a whole does is encourages each department to look at the demographics of the candidate hiring pool, and also think about like who's moving along through the entire process and who you end up hiring. And so really thinking about the candidates demographics and like thinking about at large of like, who did you recruit to, who are you asking to step in? And again, going back to something you said earlier, what are the needs versus wants? Kevina, you were mentioning this of like, are you looking for someone to have a master's, or can you look at experience, right? Because there are barriers to education. And so really thinking about who and how are the boundaries drawn within hiring teams. But yeah, I don't have experience within unionized institutions, but if anyone does, share resources. This is always a great time to like share across community.
Yeah, I feel like, seniority and diversity are necessarily mutually exclusive. Number one, don't use that as a reason to not hire a person of color. I mean, you need to also not make it, I think you said this, Kevina, don't make recruitment passive. So, I mean, even if you take a little bit longer to fill that position, be sure that you've really looked at every aspect of diversifying and still, you know, following maybe within those parameters that you have to fall into.
So we've talked about the job description, and I think that was a great place to start. There were some other things that came up in our initial conversation, and I think MaryLynn, you've touched on it a little bit here, but you know, we talked about compensation packages, about professional development opportunities, case-by-case employee benefits, and I was wondering if you could speak to that as to how that might help in the process as well.
I've had to come up with some creative compensation packages. So, and what I mean by that is sometimes I will put in benchmarks of accomplishment and write pay bumps in as part of the initial contract. That's a way to get it approved, but you're not taking the financial hit necessarily right away. You can kind of do it quarterly or by fiscal year. And at least, you know, you've got the promise in writing to that employee that, you know, keeping them is important and you're working together to get to where they need to be from a pay standpoint. Kevina, what have you done anything on your side? Because I know you've really shaken up, you know, some of the HR ways that you guys are looking at things, which I love.
It just really depends on the individual. We've paid for relocation, of course. We've even paid for someone's moving expenses during relocation, and also like 3 months of their rent. Because sometimes, you know, rent is expensive. So they want that removed. They're able to really collect their check. So there's you just have to really be creative to really promote your position. And there's different things you can do that are cost effective where you're not taking that big hit, but you can just overall, you know, assist them in different ways.
And another thing that came up that I hadn't heard about when we were talking, I think, was redacted resumes, so that people were sort of looking at the incoming candidates with, you know, as objective and as possible. I think that was the idea.
Yeah, it's really interesting, a little controversial, but you know, I pushed to do that with one of our hiring practices, and we basically redacted the resume. So therefore you couldn't look at age, you couldn't try to guess ethnicity based on names, school years, any of those things. All that got redacted, and we were just really looking at this person's qualifications and why they were interested in the job. And it's a little daunting when you first get them, because it's like, wow, okay. Where do I begin? But it really makes you be hyper focused on what you're in that room with, to be, you know, from the beginning, which is to hire a qualified candidate that can move your institution forward, and you can provide a fulfilling job experience for that individual. And it worked. It worked. We removed some of those biases, literally.
Yeah, that gets back to what Kevina was talking about what are our wants, what are our needs. And I think when you do those redactions, you get to sort of see exactly what is being offered, what the candidate is offering, as opposed to all the other implicit biases that we may have going into that process. I guess speaking of that, I think, Ivana, you mentioned some of the biases that people encounter when hiring, when we're doing interviews. And I was wondering if you could talk about some of that work, about how to overcome some of those biases, or some of the biases that get in the way of hiring and diversifying recruitment.
Yeah, so these are not all the types of biases that exist. I want to preface with that, and there's a lot of different other ones that come up, but we here at the Botanic Gardens at Matthaei, we talk about confirmation bias, first impression bias, and similar to me bias, which sound and are under a similar umbrella, right? Because with confirmation bias, you're looking at a candidate and trying to ask questions or listen to answers and how they're responding in a way that confirms what you were thinking of as the candidate's entering the room, right? And so they might have said something else, but because you're really looking for a reason to keep them or a reason to remove them from the process, you're really looking for something that they might have or might have not said. Sorry, my Spanish brain is kicking in right now. With first appearance bias, that one is very much what it sounds like. You're making assumptions on the candidate based off of what they look like, what they sound like, what they're saying. It's based off just your perception of them, right? And so you're automatically and very quickly making assumptions, and it happens to everyone, right? Like, people have biases. I have biases that I have to work on. I have been working on addressing biases, not all my life, because I was born and taught biases, but as I've entered my adult years and have really become conscious of what is taught to me through media, through books, through conversations in school, through my times at the gardens and at parks, who I'm told it doesn't belong there. I've had to critically examine like where I've learned what I've learned and what that means to unlearn and relearn, and make space for me to hear, listen, and like really understand other perceptions and other people's lived experiences, which is harder than it sounds, right? Because a lot of times we don't want to be told that we need to unlearn something. So be conscious of, as you're trying to engage in bias and thinking about it, it has to happen outside of the work time. Like, you have to do it on your own too. Like, it really just is something you have to work on by yourself. And then the other one, similar to me, bias, is when you're entering an institution and there's a candidate that reminds you of your younger self. That's the easiest way to put it a lot of the time, or someone that reminds you of someone you know. And so then you're more inclined to hire that person because you're like, oh, this puts me in a trajectory, or could have put me in a trajectory, right? And so then you're starting to really ask, or need to ask yourself, am I hiring because this person really like is a match for what we're looking for, fits this role, right? And then the word fit is also something we need to think about. But yeah, those are different types of biases that you should think about. And you should empower your teams to be confident when one of their colleagues is bringing up a bias, so they can call it out in the space, bring attention to it, and say, hey, let's take a pause. Let's take a deep breath, step back, and really think about what we're saying and what we're not saying with what we're saying.
I love that you said that, because those hidden barriers trip you up every time. I think you've got to be aware of a cultural perspective. Like I can remember, this was quite some time ago, interviewing a Navajo woman. Well, actually, I shouldn't say I was interviewing, but setting up an interview with a Navajo woman, who may show up differently in the room, whether that's simple things like eye contact, not necessarily wanting to brag about herself, that kind of thing. So when you have perhaps a white male who has an interview question about, what are you most proud of? There's a cultural filter that goes through that already is putting her at a disadvantage of how to even answer that in a way that it will be heard, that will give her that equitable playing field to get that position. So I really strongly encourage anybody that's interviewing anybody, get some type of training to be aware of these kinds of things before they're put in that position where they're making hiring decisions.
I love that you mentioned that, MaryLynn. Sorry to interrupt, Kevin, just because humility is such a part of so many cultures, and prioritizing humility over sort of pride in one's job, that I think that's such a great example of how that can interfere with maybe traditional job interviews. Sorry, Kevina.
Oh, no worries. I wanted to just kind of jump on what Ivana said about the cultural fit. I cringe when people say culture fit. I literally cringe. It shouldn't be about a fit, especially if your organization is already homogenous. You don't want people to come in there trying to fit into that organization. It needs to be a culture. I call it a cultural addition. I really try to educate my hiring manager about that. What are they adding to the organization? They need to be a cultural addition. They want to add something. And something that you can also do to kind of alleviate those barriers are having a panel. It's something as simple as that. having a panel of people that can interview this person, not too large of a panel, because some people can go to like 7 people who are like an entry-level position, but like I have a small panel, have another position that works directly with that position you're hiring for, or have an outside person who won't have any contact with this person at all to be a part of the panel so that you can get an actual feel about what this person is saying. Because there's a video on YouTube that you all can reference. It's called like, What's in a Name? It was regarding Joe versus Jose. And there's actual background on people throwing away resumes if they think that the name is too ethnic or too BIPOC, and they throw it out. They want something that more can assimilate with the organization. So you really, like they say, you really have to check your biases. We all have them. I have them. I had an interview recently, and I do this work. And I have to work on myself as well. I have to create space for myself to kind of work on myself. We were doing an interview for a person that was going to be an executive director. And we had a Latina woman interviewing. I remember looking at her resume thinking, she really doesn't have an experience to lead an organization as executive director. I just really had a bias up for that. Then I had to check myself. Kevina, maybe she doesn't have that experience because she is a Latina woman. Maybe she hasn't been given the opportunity to be in a leadership role to lead an organization, to have that experience. That does not mean she can't lead an organization. That is maybe she wasn't given a chance to, because of these same biases I have. Maybe the last person that interviewed her had that same thing. So it takes a lot of work. It's not easy, but you should be aware of them.
Yeah, and something to also go off what we're talking about within bias. Botanic gardens can, and sometimes more often than not, are rooted in ableism. So I'm going to just say that because, again, honoring what MaryLynn said earlier, we want to do better. I'm someone that wants to do better and wants our institutions to do better, right? And it's really hard to sit with that. And so as you're thinking about like what resources are available to your employees, whether your employees are full-time, part-time, temporary, students in the case of higher ed or institutions of higher ed with gardens, really thinking about how you're making space to support everyone that's entering and making sure that you're not continuously putting up barriers. As much as, I talk about this with our colleagues here, sometimes I would love to just get rid of the building and build a new one, but we can't, right? Like there's a lot of money that goes into that. And so really thinking about how do you work with partner organizations, or how do you work directly with community to listen and make sure that you're updating your policies, practices, and procedures to make sure that they truly are equitable across the board, right? And that's also hard too sometimes, but it's important for you to make the space and like think about that.
And if I could share too, and I might be jumping ahead, Toshi, but you can tell me if I am, we've talked about a lot of things that we should do. And at the end of the day, we had a really robust conversation last time we chatted about, are you able to do them? Because at the end of the day, leadership is crucial. Where are you in the organization? And if you don't have support from the top to do this, then you can talk about what you wish you could do all day long. It's key that boards are supportive, that the CEO is supportive, and not only supportive, but supportive in empowering you. I mean, I think about you, Kevina, how you have been empowered to make change from your level, and that's wildly important. And I know there are probably some people on this webinar that feel stuck because they might be the hiring manager or whatever the title is. But if everyone above you in those levels isn't buying into this as something that should happen, hasn't put pen to paper and changed the way you can do things, then it's very difficult.
Thank you, MaryLynn. And I think that that is really important. A lot of empowering, a lot of these changes come from the top, and unless there's somebody up there that's helping this process along, it's not gonna move anywhere, not the way we want it to move. I think I just want to draw back and focus a little bit again on the hiring process before we dive into institutional culture and retention. But just because Kevina, when we were bringing on new members into the IDEA committee, was really helpful by providing us with a matrix to sort of a set of criteria to sort of negate as much as possible our implicit biases. And I wonder if everyone on this, if all of you use a matrix when you're hiring people to sort of overcome those biases, or if you have experience with them, how that's gone for you. And Kevina, just because you were the one who introduced me to the idea, I'd love to hear how you use it at your job.
So I'm not in HR anymore. So let me start there. I used to be in HR, but now I have my own department here at Botanical Garden. It's called the IDEA Department, Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility. But when I was in HR, I tried to implement a matrix because it can alleviate some of those biases that you have. And it just allows you to score the applicant, the candidate, based on what they're presenting to you directly and their resume, where you aren't, they're giving you, it's just basically you allow them to score them on gaps that you're missing. So you kind of look for the IDEA committee, we looked at the gaps that we were missing from that committee. We wanted to reach those goals for ourselves. So looking at what gaps we were missing and really rank it based on that. And you can do that in your own jobs as well. So like I said, wants versus needs. What's a need for this position? If they have that, then you rank it high. If it's more of a want, which shouldn't be in your job description, but if you do have it, it should be a lower score. So when it comes down to the interview process, then it's just that score that everybody has. You all come together and see how you all score this person, and you talk about it, and then that person can move forward to the job. I can send out some resources to you all. I don't have time to do it right now, but I'm happy to share it with Toshi later so he can email you all when it comes down to the recording. But it's a really simple process, and it does alleviate a lot of the biases that come into play when it's just you and one other person doing it. Like I said, include the panel, a part of that process.
There's one last question sort of as we move on from hiring to retention that was asked in the Q&A, and that was, has each of you been successful in your efforts to diversify your pool of employees? If so, how do you message that success to help reinforce the support for the work? And I think that's, about one of the things, MaryLynn, that you often ask about is sort of how do we define success in IDEA work? So if any of you want to take that on, I think that's a great question.
I think, we're nowhere near there, but we have really made some definite inroads that we're all really excited about. Our best measure of success is having people that are working here having such a sense of belonging and a sense of place with the institution that they want more people like them to be here too. They're our best form of advertising and support. And we do, listen to our own employees when they have recommendations about people that they would want to refer here. So, I mean, that's a measure of success right there. A, that folks want to stay, and B, that they want to bring others with them. So kind of simple, not super data driven, but important nonetheless. And I also just, we are in a crazy trajectory of growth here. And we've had to literally form departments at a time, which, that's a wonderful opportunity to have. But you could imagine recruitment on, going 900 miles an hour. And so I think another measure of success is how long people stay and also want to move up and around in the institution. I mean, we have some like frontline employees, rangers, visitor services, associates who, we've been able to promote from within a lot. So that's another big measure.
I agree with MaryLynn. You can get the diversity there, but it really depends on if they want to stay. It's like, what kind of culture you're creating. But in our organization, when I started, our organization was over 80% white, over 80% in Phoenix, Arizona, which is the 5th largest city in the United States. So my question was, we have to really change our messaging. Number one, to where people want to feel like they can be included in our organization. Now we have increased our diversity by 20%. So now we're like almost a little bit over 60% still white, but we've increased our, we were really focused on the Latino population because we have a large Latino population here in Phoenix. We really want to represent the community. So we have changed our messaging. So it's a variety of things you can do. So one, I started with creating partnerships for our organization. So we really want to represent the community and look like them. So I started partnering with community organizations that work with the demographics we're trying to reach out to. And it has to be mutually beneficial. It can't be, you know, we want to hire some people that are diverse. How can we get them here? It's like, it has to be mutually beneficial for them as well. So what are they receiving back from the partnership? So whenever I have an open position, I reach out to those partners and I send them the position and I let them know we're hiring for this position. This is the pay for it. If you know anybody, please share it with your network. And usually our gardens are usually really community pillars. So people want to come work for us. They want to come work for gardens because it's a great opportunity for them. And so they usually share it out with their networks. And I mean every position, not just entry level. I'm also sharing leadership roles too with them. So they can share with your network. If you know anybody, please. And so when it comes to recruitment as well, it can't just be passive recruitment. It can't be you just posting a job and thinking that people are going to apply to it. That's not going to work. You have to do active recruitment, and that's called passive recruitment. So I'm going to start using some terms for you all. Passive recruitment is really just posting a job like on Indeed and allowing people to apply. Active recruitment is you can still post it, but then you actively search for your candidates. So you start looking at those needs for that job. So I want somebody to have this degree. I want somebody to have this experience. It's called like a Boolean search, I think Boolean search. And you're able to type in your requirements, like on LinkedIn, even on Indeed, different avenues. You're able to type in your requirements as a job hunter, as a recruiter, and put those requirements in, and you're able to search people. So what I usually do is I search people that diverse applicants, and I say, we have this job position open. If you're interested, please apply. I'm not saying you have the job. I'm saying if you're interested, please apply. You have to intentionally do the work to reach out to communities, especially when you don't have that relationship, for them to feel comfortable and trust you. Something else that I also did when I first started here at the garden, our HR website was terrible. It was a picture, it was like, we're hiring, and it was a picture of a mountain. That was it. It was nothing else. It was just in cacti, right? So I changed the entire hiring website. I made where we had diverse people on there talking about their experience and what they enjoy about the garden, why they enjoy working here, a diverse group of people. I also put our benefits, what we offer. I also put our diversity commitment. We call it a diversity and inclusion commitment. It's a quote, I guess you can say. I came up with our idea committee, and we have it blasted on different parts of our website. So people can see, yes, I will feel welcomed here. And I want you all to realize that inclusion and belonging are totally different. When I first started, my first time coming to the garden was my interview. I always tell the story, but it's true. I remember walking around the garden. I remember looking around. I was like, I don't know if I can work here, because at the time, the organization was over 80% white. I didn't see anyone that looked like me, not a soul. I didn't know then they were volunteers working in the garden. They were actually volunteers, so they were older. So I had the generational thing I was thinking about. I was also thinking about race. You know, some certain times when you're placed in an environment as one of the only, you face certain difficulties. And everyone was nice, so it was an inclusive environment, because that can be inclusive. Everyone's nice, but definitely like I belong. I did not. I looked around, I didn't see anybody that looked like me. I remember I walked into the interview room, my coworker at the time, she was Latina and indigenous, and I saw a brown face. I was like, oh, thank goodness, because I feel like I could belong and relate to her. And people have those things, like, what environment are you building when people come into your garden? Well, they feel like they belong in that organization. And that's something that you have to start from the beginning.
It's a holistic approach. I mean, if you're not doing idea work in other aspects of your institution, don't think your recruitment is or retention is gonna be easy. It's not gonna be there. And I love what you said about belonging, because you're right. I mean, being the only is not gonna, it's hard. It's hard to retain individuals when you've checked off your box, so to speak, and now you've got your fill in the blank type of person. That's not going to be sustainable at all.
Well, I feel like we moved pretty naturally into sort of retention and institutional culture. I think they're all obviously intertwined. And I love, Kevina, that you brought this up, this idea of inclusion versus a sense of belonging, and how different that can be for the people, for the people who are sort of the underrepresented folks in an institution. We can be included, but do we feel like we belong? And that's a huge question. And it's really, I think it's kind of a real shift. It takes a shift in perspective in individuals to make that happen. I think there was a question earlier about reporting of bias. How do you retain employees when there are folks who are hindering retention? I think we talked when we were first talking, there was this notion of capacity. Like, do you have the capacity to deal with bias when it rears its head in the workplace? And so I guess, obviously that's key to retention. And if you all could speak to that, I think that would be pretty helpful to us and to the audience as well.
Something our organization is thinking about right now is yearly evaluations. What do staff evaluations look like? And do you have a reporting process in place that is supportive of responding to bias or any type of discrimination that comes up within the workplace? Because, something that was mentioned earlier, within inclusion, you can have like performative inclusion, right? And like intentional inclusion. And like within the difference between like performance and intentionality comes action, right? And so if it's easy to tell when someone is being performative, not always, not everyone can tell, but if you are experienced within this world, you start seeing, oh, why is this happening for X person and not Y person? And then you start breaking down the biases that are attached to that, right? And then within intentional equity and justice, you're really thinking about how do we make sure we have structures in place to protect and support our staff. And so that's something we need to think about too, because it comes up within the realm of misconduct and safety, especially as gardens, right? That's all I have to say for that right now.
I will say also, I know I feel bad I'm like the main one talking, so I want you guys to jump in when you want to, but it also depends on how accountable you are as an organization and what policies you are creating for these people. What protections are you providing for new individuals coming to your organization? They should feel safe at work. It should be a safe space. We spend majority of our time at work, more than we spend with our families usually. So I want to be safe when I'm at work. So you have to be accountable for your employees. And if somebody is hindering retention and diversity, you have to create a path for them to move on outside your organization, because that is also, you can also have legal ramifications for that. So you have to make sure if you're really doing this work and people are doing that, create a path for them to exit your organization.
Yeah, it's part of like new employee orientation about not so much all of the tools on how to recruit or retain, but here's who we are, and this is what we are and are not going to stand for. And if you don't agree with that, then this is not the right place for you. Plain and simple. And then again, from leadership down, support that unequivocally without any exceptions.
Well, something too within retaining someone is when you're hiring someone who has been historically excluded and you're trying to diversify your staff. If someone brings something up that they're experiencing any type of bias, discrimination, then more often than not, the person who is making these reports, who is bringing their experience to light, is going to be the person that gets in trouble, who gets penalized for sharing their experience and trying to find support. And so that's a part where we really need to think about too, is like, how are you listening to what your staff are saying about how they belong, how they're experiencing the organization? And so that's something I think about too. If someone's saying they don't have enough support, why don't they have enough support? How can you find the resources to put and make sure that they're doing the best they can within their role and like supporting them. But I really like Kevina's strategy. If someone's not experiencing the organization well, a path out is support as well, right? Because sometimes you need to leave harmful environments, and that's okay because a person ultimately needs to thrive.
And I think it also stems back to the very beginning of what we talked about, interviewing. Throw away the questions you've been asking and have a conversation. Yes, I love Kevina's needs and wants, and you've got the matrix and you know what you need in this position to get the job done. But then have a conversation about, what kind of environment is this individual looking for? And I mean, don't get all hung up on, I have to ask the same 15 questions exactly the same way to the 15 applicants. You do have some bandwidth there where you're not going to get into legal trouble. You all know the questions you shouldn't ask. And if you don't, I'm sure Kevina's got some lists to send you so you can be sure you don't ask them. But at the end of the day, it's about, how do you like to get your information? How do you like to be communicated to? What are some of the things that I've literally asked, what feeds your soul? I know that sounds really poetic and a little mushy, but at the end of the day, you can start to have that conversation of really getting to know who that individual is across the table. And it helps. It helps both sides. It helps them understand whether they're a good fit for you and you're a good fit for them.
That's great. I think all this stuff is so tied up with, the whole institutional culture. Retention obviously is, it's institutional culture is key there. A person can come on, and if they think they're not a fit, they're gonna leave. And if they're not, if their needs aren't being met, it's just a paycheck to them. They're gonna figure out a way out. And I think, Kevina, it comes down to what you're saying, is a sense of belonging is going to keep people, it's going to keep people. And so I guess, there are a bunch of questions in the chat and in the Q&A, so about sort of institutional culture. And so I'm just going to sort of throw some of them out there. One comes from Tracy, who says, how would you begin tackling a garden that may not have the best relationship with marginalized communities and wants to begin becoming more inclusive? Histories of employment or pay inequity, the garden not having a strong representation with marginalized communities, etc. Asking this from the perspective that often a garden from a marginalized community's viewpoint is very different. And then there's another question that's, I think, a little bit tied in. Can you please elaborate on what was said previously about botanic gardens being rooted in ableism?
I was reading the question, sorry. I was trying to make sure I wanted to answer it correctly. So for the most part, I feel like a lot of us have strained relationship with marginalized communities. I know our garden is going to be 85 next year. And so that's a long time ago. And so something that we started doing, like I said, started creating those partnerships, building a relationship of trust, allowing them to have a seat at the table when it comes to a variety of things. When it comes to you creating your events, your programming, your content, allow them to have a seat at the table so they can see themselves within your garden. And once you build that relationship of trust, it's easy. Like I said, you create that partnership. It has to be mutually beneficial. Something that we're doing now at our garden as well. We're working with community organizations and providing them, I guess you could, so we're a garden that has to have, we're not free. We have a mission fee. So we allow them free access. We also allow them free space to use for events. So something that we have coming up this spring, we reached out to a group out here called 100 Black Men of Phoenix. They usually have a yearly jazz event, and we have them holding it here at our garden, and we're providing them the space for free. And we're also a sponsor on that for that event. So there's things that you can do to create that relationship of trust with them, so they can be trusting of you, where they want to work with you. And we all have it's America. We all have a deep history and rooted in a lot of racism, and people have been hurt by some of the things that our organizations have done. But you have to start to heal, and there's ways you can do that. And number one, it can be allowing them a seat at the table for things you're doing in the community.
And I would add to that it's a conversation. In other words, I've seen other public gardens that have gone to communities of color with, we are here to help you. Here is the thing we'd like to do for you. Or, or here's the check because we know that's what you need. Don't start with any of those things because it might not be what they need at all. And it might be that they have a better idea than you have. And so it needs to also be kind of a humbling experience that there has to be some equity in terms of the beginnings of the conversation too. You're not going into their community to tell them how you can help them. You're going into the community to introduce yourself and then be very quiet and listen.
And let me say, it is hard for people to be quiet and listen sometimes in the nicest ways. It is a challenge. It's been a challenge working with different folks, right? Because we may have good intentions, but your intentions, I'm going to be very forward, don't matter if you are having harmful impacts, right? If you're continuously shutting the door or I was talking to a colleague the other day, we are gatekeepers of our institution, right? Sometimes what we do is bring people to the gate and keep the gate closed. What are you doing? If you're trying to invite and co-create and make sure you're building relationships with communities that have been historically marginalized or historically excluded, listen. Communities know what they want to see and what they need. You have the resources and the power to make space. And a lot of times the space needs to be directed by communities. And that's hard when as institutions, we want to hold on to the power. We want to get that credit. We want to be supporters and saviors. No, just no, it takes some time. I really like that we're bringing up the word humbling. You have to enter and be humble. Will you mess up? Yes. And also that can't be the reason why you're not doing stuff. It's a both and.
I just want to say, I think for a long time, botanic gardens, and still, they think of themselves as oases, right? Something removed from your normal everyday experience, something where people come in and they get to sort of relax their guard and everything. But I think part of the difficulty with that is that, in creating this environment, they think they know best about this environment. And in fact, it excludes the community that's often immediately right next door to them. I think about, especially public gardens in urban settings, where there's no relationship with the community, and it's mostly relationships with moneyed white folks. Those kinds of institutional shifts and what you're talking about, Ivana, the ability, what we're all talking about, the ability to actually listen and to not know better than the folks that you're at a table with, is a real paradigm shift and difficult to do without really intentionality. And I think, MaryLynn, when we were speaking earlier, you said that the mission is everything, that strategic planning is the key to creating that environment and to creating authentic community engagement. And I think that was a really, I think we're all sort of, honing in on that, is that the institutional culture and the sort of community guided mission is everything in this work. And I don't know if you could expand on that and sort of how you view that from where you are as a COO. I think that'd be really helpful.
Well, we changed our mission to one that's one I can actually memorize and say is that we are a garden of experiences for all. And when we sat down to look at our strategic planning, the all is what we honed in on. And it doesn't mean that you're everything to everybody all at the same time. That just means that all should be your North Star when you're looking at the work you're doing, the programming, the collections. Everything needs to speak to the community. And so it helped us kind of guide our decisions with the board, and it helped open up discussions that I don't think we ever had before. But you start with the vision and vision planning and strategic objectives and all of that, and making sure IDEA is woven through everything that you're thinking about. And then it's rooted, right? It's an organic process that starts from the beginning. So by the time you get to, and who do we need to hire, it's already something that's become a fabric of who you are. So it sounds complex, but I mean, once we kind of honed in on that, it's so much easier to make the right decisions to help us in our journey forward. And we're by no means finished. And if you say that you're finished, then you're wrong, because nobody is. It's a journey. And you know, I know that I learn from everybody that I talk to, from Kevina, Ivana, you, Toshi. Every time you can continue to have these discussions within our community, we all get better collectively. So I'm very happy about that.
And I want to say, you know, that's absolutely right. You know, when we were putting this together and I brought it back to the IDEA committee, you know, one of the questions that came up pretty quickly was like, are you going to have anybody speak to disability and inclusion? And I sort of drew a blank and said no, and it was a little bit embarrassing, but you know, we can make that right. And so I think one of the things that we're going to do next month is to include that in the conversation, to deepen this conversation about some of the policies and the ways we can sort of incorporate disability inclusion into the hiring process and retention process. But also to the institutional point, Ivana, I think, you know, I do want to get back to that question that somebody raised about what you meant by ableism is written into the fabric of Botanic Gardens. I think that's a fascinating conversation and pertinent.
Yeah, I am not an expert in ableism. My background is not in critical disability studies. There are amazing advocates and speakers and people that you should definitely tap into, and a lot of resources out there. So I want to start off by saying that is not my background, not my expertise. And as someone who is doing and thinking about equity and justice, when I'm in the gardens, and one of the first things I, look at here at Matthaei is the spacing of the paths, right? Like when we're thinking about our buildings, like how can someone navigate the gardens? How are we providing, or how much information are we providing for individuals to make decisions for themselves of whether this is a space they can visit, and if it's a space that is not accessible for them to visit, right? And that happens within hiring as well, and what we assume that someone can and can't do based off our assumptions and how we are perceiving someone. And so I want to start off by saying all of that. Something, when I was first brought in, I've only been in this position for a little over a year, and something that's important to think about is within the realm of ableism, and as we're hiring, is what are we assuming that someone can and cannot do, right? We work with gardeners. We have an amazing team of gardeners and other individuals who may not get the job because we assume, or we as an institution don't have the appropriate resources or have made the time to find resources to support someone who is differently able to be able to enter the space. And so like that's something you need to think about, and like really think of like what tools are available, what information are we providing. And a discussion I have with my staff here is sometimes it feels like we're over communicating, but when you start looking at what you have, so many times we're not communicating enough. And so that's something we need to think about. And in another realm too is something that's prevalent within spaces that require a lot of physical work is how does fat phobia come into our discussions and our hiring decisions? How are we making assumptions again on what someone can and cannot do? And like, how do you work with a team or contract out to make sure that you're addressing these biases from the moment before you start the hiring process, right? Like, how do you make sure you keep in mind, like, who's entering the space, what you're assuming, and how you're making decisions off of that. So again, I want to say that that's not my area of expertise. That's a space where I'm continuously learning and growing. And there's amazing resources out there. If you use social media, there's a lot of amazing advocates that share their knowledge with the world that you should listen to. But there's also amazing speakers within the APGA community that you can also elevate. And so Toshi, I know that I'm a part of the idea committee, but really that's a space that as gardens, we should really be thinking about.
And just
I love,
touching
go ahead, Kevina.
Okay, I was gonna say, just touching on what Ivana's saying, there are things you can do as well to kind of remove some of those barriers. It can start with the job description. I know some of the job description we have is move, walk, talk, see, stand, you know, those lift. You can remove some of those and look at your job description. Like I said, wants versus needs. You can add different wording in there where people who are make it more accessible. And also when it comes to the interview process, you can send your interview questions beforehand, because some people have issues with being asked questions on the spot. That can be a great fit for you, a great addition for you, but you know, they might not be able to answer those questions on the spot. So I tend to send interview questions beforehand to allow people to think and really process and answer. Number one, when they get an interview with you, if they don't answer that correctly or answer it up to your ability, you know, being competent is one thing, and also being prepared is another thing. So it's not giving them an extra step, but it's just allowing them the space and time needed to really think and process what you're asking them.
A truly equitable space. I mean, I thought about what you just said about, you know, we all have, or we should have somewhere, you know, that fine print about ADA, right? About making accommodations. I think people need to take that word and really make it come alive more for you. Because if you can talk about that in a real way during the interview process, it gives candidates a safe space to talk about what those accommodations might be. Like if they get, you know, through the process, it could be new hire orientation, but it could also be during the interview process. I'll give a perfect example of also the hidden things. You know, it's like we're talking about, you know, maybe wheelchair accessibility, or can they lift, or can they walk? But, you know, we've had folks on our team who have come and said, look, I've got some real sensory issues. Could I get noise canceling headphones as part of what I need to do my job more effectively? Yes, you can. We'll get those for you. So it's things like that too, especially with so much in the whole mental health spectrum, that you need to, you don't need to ask the questions. You need to create a safe space so they can share with you and be vulnerable with you about what the needs are.
One more thing that I was thinking about too is eye contact is a hiring requirement that's uncommunicated, but there's also like ableism embedded with the eye contact we expect someone to make while they're going through an interview, or even in like the day-to-day work experience. So then like that's something to think about, and something I've seen in multiple spaces is the questioning of, well, why do you need that? Like, you don't need to know. Right. And so again, echoing MaryLynn of like making sure that you have the resources available, and you don't have to ask. Like it's really none of your business. Like just support the employee and make sure that they're doing what they need to do and have what they need to do to thrive.
Yeah, I love that, because it's also, you know, those are often cultural cues, right? Eye contact can mean very different things in a lot of different cultures. And to MaryLynn's point, they could be something hidden in the mental health spectrum. Eye contact can be super, you know, related to social anxiety, and that's not necessarily something that's going to get in the way of somebody pruning a tree or somebody, you know, a gardener position. So, you know, I think this is such a great conversation, all these different ways of thinking about all our implicit biases and how they get in the way of what we want to do, you know, creating that equitable environment. One of the things, and I want to guide the conversation this way, just because I thought it was a great moment when we were speaking. We were talking about institutional culture and sort of, you know, inclusion versus a sense of belonging. And we talked about some of these events that public gardens host, you know, to try to become more inclusive, these cultural events, Lunar New Year or Dia de los Muertos. And I think, you know, often our hearts are in the right place, but sometimes, you know, we don't know how to put our best feet forward. And so, MaryLynn, I think you had a couple great examples, both one of how not to do something, but also one of how to do something. And I'd love for you to talk on those.
Yes. I want to talk about an event that we had at South Coast that I think we did things the right way, and that was Lunar New Year. It was our first time that we had even done this event, and it was truly curated and developed and put together authentically by members of the community who celebrate Lunar New Year and who, knew what that needed to look like to truly bring the community forward in the right way. And I just have to share, that the process is longer. It can also be a little bit more messy when you got a whole bunch of folks at the table with different ideas. So I think the garden's role in that was to really support all of the ideas and then, make it be something that could realistically happen. I'm here to tell you the attendance just blew us away. And that was also after 3 days after we had both of the shootings occur in the area. And I'm going to tell you, for a beat, we had some very serious conversations as to whether we would cancel. Just for safety reasons. But then we really just decided to persevere, put lots of things in place to keep it as safe as possible, let everybody know what we were doing. And obviously everyone makes an individual choice. And I think people were really happy with the fact that, we went on with the event, and now it's going to become an annual way to celebrate all. I mean, Disco Oasis was another way to celebrate all, and really, actually that was everybody, but a new audience for us was that the LGBTQA community truly embraced that celebration and became a part of its fiber too. So, but authenticity, don't try to plan something for somebody else if you're not part of that community. Kevina, I know you can speak on that too.
Yes, that's when it goes back to, allowing them to have a seat at the table to make that decision, and actually allow them to lead, and you take a back seat. That's that listening part of it. And just regarding this work, if the idea is ingrained in your culture, then they will feel welcome. And you have to start doing small things so they can feel welcome. And that's when it also comes to, like I said, the messaging of your organization, your garden, changing your messaging where it can be more, people feel more welcome there and they can see themselves there. And if it's really ingrained in your organization, you won't have those people that are trying to hinder your progress. This is something that we're doing as an organization. It's no ifs, ands, buts about it. This is what we're doing. And like I said, there's different things you can do. I'm going to show you. I'm not bragging. This is just something that we have at the garden. But like we have an idea logo that I had our marketing team work on. And I created shirts, I created stickers, I created buttons, and our staff wears that. So people know this is something that the garden does. And it represents to them that diversity and inclusion is important to us. It's a part of our mission, it's a part of our values. And I mentioned that DEI commitment we have it listed under our values. It is a part of our mission, values, and our vision. What is the vision for your organization? And you have to do the work to really ingrain that vision where people feel welcome and feel like they can trust you as an organization.
That's great. And I think, we're going to do a deeper dive into the long-term thinking about how to change institutional culture in a couple months for our IDEA Cafe in May. So I'm really looking forward to, maybe some of you all on this panel would also like to participate in that, because I think it's such an important conversation, and it really gets us to the real meat of the issue, the core of the issue. And I guess I just want to ask, before we go and before we dive into some of these more specific questions, if there's anything that you feel we've left out that you think is core to the issue, any policy changes that you think when it comes to sort of hiring and retention that we've left out. Is there anything that you really want to hone in on or point out that people can do to make a real change sort of, this month or this year, to start kicking this stuff into gear?
Well, first you have to create goals for yourself, right? You can't just say, we want to diversify. What areas are you trying to reach? Create actual goals for yourself. And I'm not saying anything like affirmative action, but just actual goals that you can create as far as how you want to reach the community and numbers wise. That's something that you're able to do. To set, objectives for yourself and goal posts for yourself to reach. And that's where the whole matrix comes in at. Basically, you use that for that. But set goals for yourself and to see where your gaps are in your organization. And every community is different. So Phoenix is a majority Latino community, so we really focus on trying to increase our Latino population here. But if your city or your area has more indigenous, then focus on that and focus on small steps for yourself. But I want you all to remember that no organization is perfect. I can talk about the work I've done, but we still have a long way to go. Okay, we are not a perfect garden at all. We still have a long way to go, but create small goals for yourself. And like I say, really ingrain it into your organization and your culture where it's no question about it. And you have to start small. You have to create small wins. If it's just even having an idea committee and working together and creating a D&I commitment, a D&I statement, something like that, where people are more feel like they can be welcome at your organization, then do that. But make sure you are creating a space for people to want to stay. Because like I said, you can get the numbers all you want, but if it's not the culture or it's not an environment they feel safe, they will not stay. And what's the purpose of the work you're doing?
Just real quick, the other thing is that to make change, you have to change. Like you have to reprioritize and make space and time for you to enact change, right? Like it just doesn't happen. I know when I was hired in, and this happens to DEI managers in many different fields, a lot of fields, they expect someone to come in and, snap their fingers and boom, everything is done. We're cured. We figured it out. No, it takes a long time to understand the org, make suggestions. But if your organization is committed, you need to make the time to make the policy changes, to evaluate programs, processes, and procedures to make sure that you are thinking, and not only don't just stay in the thinking phase, actually make the change, right? Because sometimes in higher ed, we love to think, we're thinkers. We also like to talk. And so just important to make sure that we are taking action, right? Because action speaks louder than words. And I know that's a little cheesy, but it's true. If you're talking a lot about making change, but you're never ever doing anything, people will notice, people will see.
Yeah, and don't expect the people of color or the DEI people to solve the problem. It shouldn't be on them to make the change. It's the whole institution that needs to do that. As far as quick wins, go to your HR department or whoever is the keeper of your job descriptions and take a look at them. You'd be surprised if you've listened to this webinar, what you find, even through your own lens.
I think that's great. I think all those things are super helpful, immediate sort of projects. I want to jump into some of these questions that have gone unanswered in the Q&A, and they're more specific to things that were brought up. But one is, how would you balance redacting resumes to avoid bias versus wanting to actively value qualities and experiences someone from a marginalized community might bring that are not necessarily reflected in formal qualifications? So does redacting actually maybe stifle some of the stuff we want to bring out?
We redacted to get rid of ethnic or racial bias, AKA names. We redacted to get rid of any kind of age discrimination with dates, anything that would be a gender bias. And kept it simple at first. That alone allows you the freedom to just look at qualifications. Now, you could go deeper and go, well, I'm judging this school versus that one. If that's the case, then I'll just be very frank and say you've got the wrong person interviewing. If they're leaning into that much bias to determine whether someone's qualified or not.
Another one that's in the chat here. It says Teresa asks, how can we link pay ranges and promotions with DEI? I wonder if, I'm not sure what that means. MaryLynn, you nodding your head?
Oh, I nod my head when I'm listening intently, but I'm not sure either. Pay ranges with I mean, I just think it's just having an equitable pay, wage and compensation program to begin with. I know that Kevina, you all have done wage and compensation studies, so you're further along than we are here, but that's something that we have in our strategic plan to do.
And that's kind of what I mentioned as far as gaps. There's so much you can do with your data. You can look at your current organization, your current employees, and look at where the gaps are. Look at the ranges. Is it equitable across the board? And that's how you kind of link. And look at the promotion. Who's been promoted within the last? I look at the data from the last 5 years. I'm looking at retention. I'm looking at pay. I'm looking at promotions. And then you can start working from there. Look at the gaps in your organization and start working and use a DEI lens through that work.
I will say real quickly, within higher ed, there is a lot of discussion between pay ranges, promotions, and IDEA or DEI. And so that's a space that you can look into. I know here we're talking about professional development. What are we expecting staff to learn? How are we making time and resources to make sure that they are experiencing and developing skills? And so how are you evaluating that at the annual review, and what does that look like for your organization? And so that's the place where you could start and think about, but it's not the only place.
Yeah, I also want to say, I think there's been a lot of discussion over the past several years about a living wage and what that means, to pay a living wage. And again, to your point, MaryLynn, it's an equity issue, right? And so folks like Kara Newport at Filoli are doing that work with the living wage and really trying to make that happen. And I think probably there are other examples that I don't know, but that I did attend a seminar on. But I think, yeah, it's absolutely an IDEA issue, what we're paying people to do work at the institutions that that we're a part of. I think there's another one. I think this is for you, Kevina, from Lisa. It says, what type of messaging, because you were showing all that messaging stuff that you were working on, what type of messaging do you recommend? And maybe that means sort of in both in the short term and in the long term.
Just kind of what I said before. Just look at how your HR hiring page looks. That could be messaging to the public. Look at the way you recruit and that process. I know somebody put policies in there, so create a recruitment policy that certain positions have to have a panel. There's certain things you can do regarding just different policies you can make in messaging, but allow the messaging to the public to be that you're welcoming. Like I said, look at your HR page and what does it represent? Does it represent that somebody like me can come into that organization and be comfortable, or does it seem as exclusive? And if it looks like it's exclusive, then change your messaging. Sometimes you have to change messaging even with language, right? You can make things bilingual. If you have a large number of population that speaks a different language, put it on there. Allow them to feel welcome in your environment in a variety of ways. They can see themselves through those different ways and wants to work for your organization.
Thank you, Kevina. I think we've gotten to most of the questions here. And I want to say that, again, I've listened to another amazing conversation that the three of you had about these issues, and really putting solutions on the table for everyone. And I think the comments in the chat really reflect that. Just so much positivity and so much people saying, oh, this is great work for us to think about in the future. And I think, I'm so grateful to the three of you for taking the time to speak to this and to bringing your professional experiences to bear. I want to remind folks that next month we're going to have an Idea Lounge, which is our free form sort of participant centered conversation on disability inclusion in recruitment, but probably it's going to become a much broader conversation because it will be so free form. And we'll probably have another one later in the year as well, because I think it's such an important topic that's only really coming to the fore for public gardens, you know, in the past handful of years. The other thing I want to remind people is in May, we're going to be having a focus on institutional culture, on policy, on long-term changes to institutional culture, and how to read data and not let it become your enemy when we're doing idea work, but to use it to really advance the work you're doing. And then in June, we're going to have our conference, and our Idea Cafe there is going to be very exciting. So anyone who comes to conference, the Idea Center and Denver Botanic Garden are putting on an amazing Idea Cafe, and we're going to have a physical Idea Lounge there as well. So we welcome you all who are going to conference to visit us at the Idea Lounge, which will be the embodiment of sort of the free form Idea Lounge cafes that we host. I want to ask our participants again if there's anything that they want to close with, and thank our viewers for coming.
I just want to thank you, Toshi, for moderating. And I think that we have a participant that still had a pending question, but given we're out of time, if he wants to, I think, email any one of us, we'll be sure that we can address that. I just don't want to leave anybody hanging with a question.
We do have a little bit of time. So I was going to close early, but what Eduardo Quevedo, I'm just trying to find the question that was asked. Oh, when talking about IDEA, sometimes committee members or staff will want to solely prioritize equity in matters that pertain to money, pay, salary raise, etc. And people won't always be happy with the way things look, despite equity efforts being in place. What is your recommendation navigating those difficult conversations when you have staff that are union and non-union and in various leadership and non-leadership positions? That's a great question. And I think we have enough time to at least answer it a little bit more than superficially.
I hope I'm answering the question. I can only just share our experiences. I'd mentioned that Kevina and the garden that she's at have already done like wage and compensation studies, et cetera. We have not gotten there yet. And as a result, you know, it's difficult to look at pay equitably and not have a wage compression issue. So we're going to get there. It's a journey. We want to be sure we can get there. But in the meantime, I'm looking at other ways that we can close those gaps, if you will. If it can be anything from professional development opportunities to staging out, getting folks pay where it needs to be, to other benefits that we might be able to offer that would not be a direct financial burden on the institution. And I might not have answered your question at all, Eduardo, but I'm going to turn it over to my much more capable colleagues, Ivana and Kevina, to help me.
Kevina, do you want to go or do you want me to go?
Let me process this for a minute. You can go ahead.
Okay, yeah, because I'm still processing and understanding. So something that I'm reading is that committee members only want to focus on equity when it relates to money. And so any conversations outside of the realm of idea aren't necessarily being discussed. So something I've experienced in my role, so I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion manager. And I really appreciate your comment about there's a huge overlap between idea and HR matters. And one is culture change, and another one is organizational change, like policies, practices, and procedures. Sometimes they can go hand in hand, but a lot of times they're lumped into one. And so I know when I started, people started tapping into me of like, there are financial equity issues. And so I needed to work with HR and listen to what staff were saying and bring it in, because my role was being confused or misunderstood, because people thought, okay, well, now that we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion manager, we'll be able to have better pay, right? because we are at a university, there are policies set by the Board of Regents that really prevent each department and unit to expand on their own pay. And that is something that we might be able to have some type of advocacy, but really for there to be larger pay changes at a university, you need to go to the regents and people who have the highest form of power, right? So now going back to your question about like when IDEA member committees only want to focus on equity, that's when you can tap in on your colleagues, whether they're in your garden or in APGA, right? You can't do this work alone. You need community to be able to advance this. So tap into someone who can come in and, if they're not listening to you, expand what IDEA is, expand that it's not only in pay, but it can be within programming, it can be within culture. There's so many different facets of IDEA that sometimes we're zeroed in on like making change in one area because it's more pertinent to our experience. And just because it's pertinent to our experience doesn't mean that it's the only thing we should focus on, because I think that's part of the reason why sometimes people freeze up, especially people who have not been historically marginalized or have been marginalized, right? Because like that's where they feel that they have the most power. And so it's sometimes just having that difficult conversation, but we don't all have that risk that we can, put on the table.
I need a little bit of a do-over because now I've reread your stuff, Eduardo, and you're right. I did not answer it at all. The equity piece that has to do with everything but money, whether that's job titles, whether that's job responsibility equity, whether that's workload equity. I feel like there's a number of different ways you could try to enter that and still, be able to engage the audience that you're trying to convince. Build your own advocacy from within, and you just have to tackle all of these other equity issues one at a time. I think it's important that there's got to be some higher level training about literally the definitions of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Because if you don't even have a common language of understanding, you're never going to get anywhere with folks that are only going to look at equity and make it be about money.
Thank you both for that answer and for getting it in under the wire. And thank you for your patience, Eduardo. I missed that question in the chat. This conversation will continue through the whole year, at least, about diversity in particular, but also about these sorts of conflicts that arise and how to resolve them. So Dolores Ashworth, you asked me about a future IDEA Cafe and sort of some of this stuff that Eduardo talked about. We're definitely going to be diving into this. So please come back to the IDEA Cafes down the road, and we'll be happy to continue engaging this. I think it's some of the most important work that Botanic Gardens are doing right now. So thank you all again for coming. Thank you, MaryLynn, Kevina, and Ivana for participating. It's always a pleasure to see you and to listen to you on this topic. And thank you, Brianna, for your work as well. And we'll see you at the next one. Bye, everyone.